A waitress dances tap with his disabled son. A billionaire feels happiness for the first time. What if a billionaire, used to controlling the world through numbers and power, suddenly faces something beyond his control? His own son, partially paralyzed and cut off from life. Before we begin the story, please write in the comments which part of the world you are watching from today. Richard Montgomery hated applause, especially those that came too early. His usual world was quiet, precise, and predictable like the numbers in a bank account. That's why he chose the restaurant lane, where the waiters move silently and the tablecloths are thicker than the surfaces in his offices. Tonight, for the first time in years, he was not alone. To his right sat Lucas, his 10-year-old son, whose skin was too pale and movements uncertain. Since the doctors uttered the phrase partial paralysis, the child's life became narrow. Clinics, caregivers, physiotherapy, dance, music, laughter. It all seemed like a different world that he could no longer enter. But that very evening, something happened, something no one expected. A live piano began playing Spring Awakening, and at that very moment, Lucas, barely standing, reached across the table. "Dance with me," he said. "Not the waitress's father, Diana." A pause fell in the hall. You could hear someone drop a utensil. The restaurant manager was already rising from his seat, but Diana only held his gaze for a second. Then silently, she took off her apron, walked around the table, and took the boy's hand. The music continued. 3 cautious, hesitant steps, each like on ice. People stopped eating. Someone turned on their phone camera, another looked away, embarrassed. But Richard couldn't look away. His son, who hadn't stood without help for years, was moving, slowly, awkwardly, but independently. He didn't understand how it was possible. He only understood one thing: he was no longer in control. Later, when the boy fell asleep in the car, Richard replayed this episode again and again, not because of his son's gesture, but because of the woman. Who was she? Why was she not afraid of the cameras, the looks, or him? The name on the receipt was Diana Johnson. He remembered it and decided that tomorrow this name would be worth much more than a tip. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He did not feel irritation or think about meetings or reports. He was watching a video that had gone viral, a little boy dancing with a waitress to live music, and a comment below the clip. Maybe this dance was his first step, and for someone, the last chance to change everything. By the afternoon, he already knew where Diana worked, where she lived, and which courses she completed. All in 1 hour, he sent a courier with his business card. She came to the Montgomery Tower the next day, without a folder, notebook, or fear. "I want to offer you a job," he said when they were alone. "I suspected that," she calmly replied. "Not as a waitress. You could be a companion, an emotional crutch," he interrupted. He fell silent. She looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't sell emotional support. I create conditions where a child grows independently." Before he could ask a single question, she stood up. "You seek control, but your son needs freedom. If you ever want to see what that looks like, come to my center for an open lesson." "The center?" "Freedom Steps, Dance Therapy. Your team refused funding 3 times. Formal status, they said." She left without saying goodbye, and suddenly he felt not irritation but interest. The next day, he arrived at her center unannounced and without security. The first thing he heard was laughter. The second, music. The third, the voice of Professor Mercer, whose name he knew from Harvard. And the fourth was a step, a single independent step by Lucas. Not recorded by cameras or press, only by Diana and his father. When uncertainty arose in Richard Montgomery's life, he acted according to a scheme: analysis, influence, control. But this time it was different. He stood in the corner of a small hall with a wooden floor, modest mirrors, and worn audio speakers. And his son danced, not like a champion but like a free person. "By himself," said Dr. Mercer, observing, "the first independent step, a micro-effort of the thigh muscle. You don't understand how much this means. Richard nodded but understood it was much more complicated than neuroplasticity. His son didn't take this step on a treadmill under the supervision of a physiotherapist. He took it here, among children who laughed at every fall, not afraid to seem clumsy. And at the center of this world stood Diana Johnson. After the lesson, he approached her, not as a patron, but as a man who had seen a miracle and wanted an explanation. "Why didn't you tell me right away who you are? Would you have listened?" He remained silent. She continued, "When you look at people, you see positions, portfolios, statistics. At the restaurant, you saw a waitress, but I saw a child who wants to take a step. Everything else is irrelevant. You manipulated, used this moment in public to—" "Stop," she interrupted, not raising her voice. "I did not use your son. I accepted his step. That's not the same." He felt his jaw tighten. Inside, everything boiled with a feeling of lost control. And if he fell, he would fall many times, but it would be his fall, not yours. Later, in his office, he opened the file prepared by analysts. Everything he had learned about Diana in the past day turned out to be just a tiny part of her real story. Diana Johnson, graduate of New York University, Child Development Department, co-author of the Freedom Steps program. She had worked in a children's rehabilitation center before it closed due to lack of funding. She had applied to the Montgomery Foundation 3 times and was rejected each time. Reasons given: insufficient legal protection, lack of partners, insufficient organizational maturity. But now her name was being talked about in the press. After the dance in the restaurant with his son, he still wanted to accuse her of a calculated act, a subtle use of emotions to promote her own program. But every time he went back to that moment, he only saw a hand reaching out to the boy, not to the audience. 3 days later, he returned to her center, this time alone, without his son, without security. He asked, "You said you create conditions." She did not answer immediately, only brought a chair and pointed to the room. He looked inside and saw a girl with an amputated leg and a boy with a prosthetic arm. They were laughing. Diana started a simple rhythmic music and began a slow, almost invisible dance with them, not explaining, not commanding, just moving and letting them follow. First slowly, then with more confidence. "We don't train muscles," she finally said. "We teach the body to trust itself through movement, through contact, through play." He did not know how to respond. This was nothing like his world. No schemes, no algorithms, no charts, just a gentle, invisible force pushing toward freedom. When he returned home, Lucas was waiting, smiling. "Dad, can I go back there tomorrow?" he asked. Richard nodded, then asked, "Why did you choose her in the restaurant?" Lucas thought for a moment. "Because she wasn't afraid of me or that I might fall." Late at night, Richard opened Diana's file again and finally saw not numbers but a person. She was not looking for funding. She was fighting for the right to work and did not need a savior. Her work was already saving lives. He realized her strength wasn't in methods but in the refusal to give up when systems fail, in the ability to hear those who are unheard, in the courage to take a child's hand without knowing who's watching from the next table. The next day, he invited the foundation board to his office. "We were wrong," he said. "We had a working program before our eyes, but we refused it. Now I propose we change that." "Full funding?" one lawyer asked. "For 5 years," Richard confirmed, with one condition: no interference with the methodology or management, full freedom for Diana and Dr. Mercer. "This is unprecedented." "It's necessary," he interrupted. On the 42nd floor of the Montgomery Tower, behind mirrored glass walls, silence reigned. Not a detail was accidental. Minimalism, chrome, glass. Everything spoke of power, control, and inaccessibility. Diana sat calmly across from Richard with a straight back. She wore the same simple gray sweater as in the center. It seemed she wanted nothing, and that unsettled Richard. "Your project will receive full funding," he said. We are ready to invest significant resources in expansion, new premises, hiring specialists, all under your management. Why now? She asked. I saw my son take a step without help. That's an argument hard to ignore. An argument you hadn't noticed before, he answered. She pressed her lips together. I admit my mistake, he said after a pause. You want trust. In these conditions, full freedom. 5 years with you as curator, Dr. Mercer as scientific supervisor. Diana did not smile. It's not about trust, she said. It's about understanding boundaries. I won't be your employee, I won't appear in reports. I don't sell success and definitely not children for a pretty presentation. Richard looked at her for a long time. He was used to people thanking for such offers. Diana, no. How do you see it then? He asked. She did not answer immediately. She went to the window and looked at the city. Millions of lives below, each in its own struggle. I see a space without hierarchy, without dictatorship, where everyone can be themselves, even if that means falling, even if that means chaos. You want the foundation to invest in chaos? I want your foundation to invest in freedom. He left the office in complete silence. Advisors, assistants, lawyers greeted him. They all had questions, charts, documents. But he heard no one. Deep inside, the words of his late wife surfaced. Dance is not about steps, but contact. As long as you control everything, you don't dance, you command. And he understood. Diana was not challenging. She simply refused to accept the rules everyone else played by. A week later, they signed the agreement. No press release, no fanfare. The Montgomery Foundation invested in the expansion of the Freedom Steps Center, in building a new building, in the specialist training program, and in research supervised by Dr. Mercer. Diana refused to be the face of the project. She refused any role related to managing the fund. I stay in the hall. This is my place, she said. When construction began, Richard came to the site without a suit or driver. Lucas was already there, helping to place flags with other children. One of them, a boy in a wheelchair, asked, "Are you really the son of that Montgomery?" "Yeah," Lucas nodded, "but today he's just my dad." Richard heard this and felt something shift inside him. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but very important. That same evening, he asked Dr. Mercer for the first selection of literature on neuroplasticity and began reading, not to learn how to control the process, but to understand how not to interfere. Open lessons at the Freedom Steps Center were not publicly announced. There were no banners, no social media posts, no journalists, only parents, children, volunteers. And the music was not background noise but pulsing like the breath of a living organism. Richard entered the hall without warning. He appeared more and more often like this, unexpectedly, without security, without a suit, less often with a notebook, more often with attention. The hall was full. The boy with the shin prosthesis was teaching a girl in a wheelchair the basics of spinning. 3 teenagers argued about how to improvise on a song without rhythm. A little child, barely starting to walk, tried to catch a ball, but his gaze was fixed on Lucas. The boy who 6 months ago could not stand longer than a minute without support was now slowly rising from a deep squat without help or commands. Diana stood nearby but did not intervene. She just nodded like a conductor who senses when to enter. Lucas took a step, then a second, light but confident. The hall did not applaud or gasp. Everything continued as usual because here this was the norm. Only Richard froze, as if seeing his son for the first time, not as a project but as a being with his own will. Later he approached Diana, not with a proposal or a report, but with a question. "How did you know he was ready?" "I didn't know," she replied. "I just stopped interfering." He nodded silently. It was painful to admit that sometimes love takes the form of control, and only by letting go can you see who stands before you. A week before the first phase of building the new center, a fund lawyer approached Diana with standard contract approval procedures. He was polite and precise with tables and terms. She reread the first clause and quietly smiled. Where is the clause about the independence of the methodology? Please clarify. Full freedom, without edits, revisions, or approval of each step. This was the original condition. The lawyer hesitated. Sorry, but for investments of this scale. She closed the folder and returned it to him. Then there will be no investment. 2 hours later Richard entered the hall. This is a mistake. The extra paperwork will be fixed. This is not a mistake, this is the system. Everything must be controlled, even what is not understood. I'm trying to understand, he said softly. I see, but that's not enough. You need to learn to step back, not once, but systematically. He looked at the hall where children continued to move, fall, and laugh. Everything was off plan. Everything worked. A week later, Richard personally signed the final version of the contract. 1 page, 1 signature, 1 clause. Complete methodological and organizational independence of the Freedom Steps project. No interference from the investor. At the morning lesson, Lucas approached a new girl who only communicated through gestures, showing fear of standing up. He kneeled beside her and reached out his hand without words or pressure. Diana watched and nodded. Now he is truly leading. The next day, a request arrived at the fund office from a major media company. They wanted to film a documentary about Montgomery's transformation and Freedom Step. The fund's press office prepared a release, script, list of topics, and comments. Richard skimmed through it and said, "Throw it out. Let them film what they see. If we try to control the story, we are no longer in it." That evening he was back in the hall, this time aside, without questions or instructions, watching the children move, make mistakes, find their rhythm. He didn't understand the entire methodology or know the terms but felt there was more life here than in all his annual reports. This was the turning point, quiet, unpublicized. Cameras didn't catch it, but at that moment, the billionaire stopped being a conductor and became an observer. At the opening of the new Freedom Steps Center building, everyone came. Parents, children, volunteers, teachers, even those who once doubted the project. They stood by the stage not because they were invited but because it was impossible to ignore what was happening here. Against the backdrop of sleek architecture, light, glass, wide halls without thresholds or stairs, the most noticeable was the hall without a stage. Just a circle, simple wooden floor, mirrors, and music flowing from somewhere above. Here, among hundreds of people, Lucas did something that truly changed not only his father but everyone watching. He approached a little girl wearing an exoskeleton. She was crying, not from pain but from fear. The first step seemed impossible to her. Lucas knelt beside her and, just like Diana once did with him, simply reached out his hand without words or promises. Just a hand. She looked for a long time, then took 1 step. He took the second step next to her, then she took the third. They continued until they were in the center of the circle. The music did not stop, no one applauded. Everyone just watched as movement was born that had no conductor. At that moment, Richard, the father, the billionaire, the man whose power was once measured by charts, stood by the wall and did nothing. He knew this was not his stage. He was not meant to be in the center. His place was beside, not ahead or behind, but beside. Later, during a brief press conference, when one reporter with a condescending smile asked, "Mr. Montgomery, you are now investing in something that does not bring direct profit. Don't you think this is more of an image project than a real contribution to the economy?" Richard looked at Lucas sitting in the circle with the other children and said, "True leaders do not show the way. They know when to follow those who show the best direction." The journalist fell silent. The next day Diana received a handwritten letter without signature or address. It said, "You were right. Sometimes the first step is not moving forward, but stepping back to make space for someone else. Thank you for not giving up." She folded the letter and put it in a drawer, where dozens of drawings, notes, and photos of children she once took by the hand were already kept. not to lead, but to be beside them as they choose their own path. 3 months later, the center began full operation. Dr. Mercer received approval for a grant to study the effects of dance therapy. Lucas took off his second brace earlier than expected. Richard began giving private lectures for prominent businessmen on the topic: how not to interfere with those who know what they are doing. None of them needed each other anymore. They became not helpers or sponsors, but part of one movement. At the half-year celebration of the center, Diana stayed backstage. She did not like the spotlight or believe in awards. She just observed. Lucas stepped into the circle, not alone. Around him were dozens of children. When the same melody played that had been played in the restaurant, he made a movement that took everyone's breath away. For the first time, he led, not as a child to be protected, but as a person who can feel another's rhythm, including those who are afraid, shy, or think they cannot. Richard did not step into the center. He stayed in the shadows. And this was the loudest statement of his life. He no longer led. He followed. The end. True transformation in this story does not happen in the stands or headlines, but in the quiet of the room where an adult man consciously chooses to stay aside, not because he was pushed away, but because he chose to let go. Richard Montgomery, once accustomed to obeying numbers and control, finally understood: not every step needs control. Some steps simply need to be allowed. Lucas didn't just learn to walk. He learned to lead, to be part of, to support others. And Diana, originally seen as a random figure, became the one who created the conditions where not only the child's strength but also the father's vulnerability unfolded. In their interaction, there were no winners or losers, only growth, trust, and movement. Thus ends a story not about a miracle, but about the choice when those who hold power learn not to show the way, but to follow those who feel it better. When dance becomes a metaphor not for freedom from limits, but for escaping the illusion of control. And that, perhaps, is the true victory.